Hi, I'm Nicole Bullotta, and I'm going to talk to you about trust-based relational intervention versus cognitive behavioral therapies for children who have been through trauma. First, I'm going to talk about why I chose this topic. While exploring potential topics for this project, I knew I wanted to focus on therapy practices. I think there are many times that children are expected to have the cognition of adults, and when a child experiences trauma, we expect them to tell us about it and why they think it happened. But that is not our story to tell. That story belongs to these children. Sometimes a child may not want to talk about what has happened to them, and that is something that as professionals we should respect. Because of this, I turned to find other therapies besides the well-known cognitive behavioral therapies. In my research, I found trust-based relational intervention. First, I will tell you what trust-based relational intervention is. Texas Christian University has done numerous studies in research projects on trust-based relational intervention. In 2013, they published an article called Trust-Based Relational Intervention, a Systematic Approach to Complex Developmental Trauma. In this article, TBRI is described as a holistic therapeutic model that focuses on treating complex developmental trauma. It can be effective for at-risk children of all ages, and what is so great about trust-based relational intervention is that it is designed to treat multiple subpopulations. So no matter if the child was abused, neglected, placed into a foster home, long-term hospitalization, or suffered a natural disaster, this is an effective treatment for them because as a result, the behavior components are all similar. Texas Christian University has also identified 3 principles of TBRI: empowerment, connection, and correction. These principles are designed to help the child and caregiver to learn healthy ways of interacting. Empowerment ensures that all basic needs are met. Connection focuses on attachment and relational needs, and correction focuses on healthy behaviors and self-regulation. The empowering principles focus on the factors that influence the child's emotional development. This can mean changing the child's environment to make sure that the child is actually safe as opposed to feeling safe. Cognitive behavioral therapies create a safe environment while the child is in the therapist's office, but what happens once they leave the office? The basics behind this are, for an example, if the child was cold, you would give them a jacket or a blanket to warm up. This is a basic need that you have now met. When a child can count on you to meet basic needs, they begin to trust you. This idea is applied to trust-based relational intervention. When a caregiver consistently meets the needs of a child, the child begins to trust them. Other aspects on the empowering principle are sensory needs, nutrition, adequate sleep, and physical activity. Children who experience trauma are often prone to sensory processing issues, meaning that exposure to different senses can be overwhelming to them, such as a scratchy texture of a shirt or the silky texture of a blanket. Along with this can come behavior disorders, poor social skills, delayed motor skills, and a decrease in academic performance. Next, what is very critical in forming attachment with the child who has suffered the trauma is the connecting principles that work to promote healthy, secure attachment between the caregiver and the child. This principle is centered on establishing a level of trust between the traumatized child and caregiver. What is important about this is that it is designed to give a voice to a child who may not have had the opportunity to have one or who has had their voice taken away. What I mean by this is imagine you are working with a child who has been placed into foster care and who has been removed from their home. This child has already been traumatized once by his or her biological parents, and now they will constantly be moved around into different foster care homes. This child does not know how to communicate what it is that they need from you because they have not had consistent care. In Texas Christian University's research, this is referred to as something called giving voice. With this comes a greater need for awareness. A caregiver has to pay more attention to a child's nonverbal behavioral responses because they cannot always tell you that this upset me or I did not like this. When a caregiver can recognize a child is in distress, they can then help alleviate the stress, which in turn builds trust between the two of them. Other important aspects of the connecting principle are playful engagement and attunement. Playful engagement is just how it sounds. It is an interaction between the caregiver and child through different activities of play. Essentially, the therapist will teach the caregiver how to positively interact with the child during playful activities. This can reduce anxiety, build social skills, and strengthen the attachment. Attunement focuses on interpersonal engagement. Caregivers will be taught how to use appropriate tones of voice, eye contact, safe touches, and body positions. TCU did a study on how attunement is critical to building trust with a child. When their staff was working with at-risk children, they would periodically offer the children Tootsie Roll Pops. At the beginning, the child would choose whatever color they wanted, but over time the child began to choose the color that the caregiver would choose. Although this is a small example and may not mean something to a lot of people who aren't trained, it shows how much a child can trust someone in that moment. The last principle is the correcting principle. The goal of correction is to build the social skills and bring empowerment and connection together. It may help you to think of this as the last step of therapy, where the therapist will use the healthy connection and secure attachments to correct previous behaviors. For those of you who are familiar with cognitive behavioral therapies, this may sound very familiar, and it is. But trust-based relational intervention is focused on being proactive rather than reactive to negative behaviors. This is why there were two founding principles ahead of correction. Rather than addressing solely the traumatic event, TBRI wants to focus on how the trauma has affected the child in areas of their development, and it also focuses on giving the child tools to correct the future behaviors. This could be things such as teaching a child to identify when they are being overwhelmed and learning how to step away from their stressors. How the child reacted to their trauma is now their natural reaction to any kind of stress. This is why TBRI focuses on treating the whole child rather than just the specific event of trauma. Back to cognitive behavioral therapies. In 2000, the Journal of Interpersonal Violence addressed how changing a child's cognition can affect their behavior. In a clinical setting, the therapist would have to gauge the child's current cognition. Next, the therapist would take the child's narrative and replace it with a positive alternative. In turn, this is meant to change the child's behavior and how they think about the trauma that has happened to them. Cognitive behavioral therapies also address how the parent or caregiver views the trauma. Most of the time, parents assume it's their fault because they're meant to be the protectors of their children, and when they experience trauma, they also experience guilt. Once the parents have dealt with guilt, the therapist will teach stress management. Again, this just involves a positive dialogue between the caregiver or parent and the child. While this creates a feeling of safety, I felt that trust-based relational therapy addressed key issues behind the trauma and made the child safe, rather than creating a temporary feeling of safety. Finally, the Journal of Interpersonal Violence realized that cognitive behavioral therapies will not work for all children. This therapy is very effective for children who are willing to tell their story, but most of the time other interventions such as medication or other psychosocial therapies are needed along with this type of treatment, whereas trust-based relational intervention can effectively treat those subpopulations regardless of what type of trauma they have endured. While I think that both therapies can be helpful to a traumatized child, I saw greater effectiveness in trust-based relational intervention because it was truly centered on relational-based trauma. I also felt it was more respectful of the impact of the trauma, whereas cognitive behavioral therapies were centered around the event of trauma and how the child viewed that. Children internalize what has happened to them in different ways than adults do. It is important to remember that trauma will affect many different aspects of their lives and relationships. It is simply not enough to change how the child thinks of a trauma. Professionals need to examine how the child sees their trauma and how it has changed their lives and their relationships and their view of the world. I thought that trust-based relational therapies did a better job of being mindful of the whole child's development and also the relationship that they have with their caregivers. So that is why I have chosen trust-based relational therapy over cognitive behavioral therapy for children who have experienced trauma. Thank you.